Welcome to the fourth webinar in our second webinar series, Reimagining Supply Chains in the Digital Economy. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to thank our sponsor, the Port of Newcastle, and also our supporters, Macquarie Business School, Center for Workforce Futures, and Michigan State University's Broad College of Business. My name is Norma Harrison, and I'm a professor of management at Macquarie Business School in Macquarie University. And I'm going to serve as the moderator for our session here today. We've got a great team here providing support for this webinar. I'm assisted by Razia Tavaloy and Elena G. Liangjie, both from Macquarie Business School. The fourth and last webinar in this series is called Digitalisation, the New Normal for Logistics and Transportation. In this webinar, we've had quite a bit of interest with over 165 registrations, and we have a group of presenters who are all experts in port systems and digitalisation. We have Peter Creeden, who is Managing Director, MPC International, Mark Wells, Vice President, Global Partnerships in Navis. He's located in Hong Kong. Daryll Hull, who's Professor and Co-Director of the Center for Workforce Futures, Macquarie Business School. And today also we have two Americans as panelists, one living in Sydney and the other in Hong Kong, such as internationalization. Peter Creeden has spent 30 years in supply chain, shipping, global IT, and corporate management. He served as a senior executive for more than 20 years at Hamburg Süd, first in New Jersey, then Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and then Sydney, Australia. Peter Creeden is presently the Managing Director of MPC International, which provides advisory and business development for transport, supply chain, freight, and technology companies. He's also a founding partner of the Future Ports 2050 project at Macquarie University's Center for Workforce Futures, serving as the chair of the Industry Advisory Group. He was recently appointed to the board of the Mizzen Group, a digital revenue management company which allows freight sellers to dynamically set prices, distribute and manage contribution margins and in an efficient and highly scalable way. Peter lives and breathes digitalization and is a very strong advocate of new technology. I wouldn't dare offer a manual option to Peter if there are high technology options available. What is not shown here, and indeed commendable, is Peter's involvement in the organization Restart Us, where unique technology can be used for unemployed or low-income juveniles and adults to find innovative and holistic ways to overcome inequality while delivering healthy returns on public investments. Oh yes, Peter was a professional sailor in his 20s, and that's how he got into shipping. Peter Creeden graduated from Texas A&M with a Bachelor of Science in Maritime Administration. So with pleasure, I present to you Peter Creeden.
Thank you, Norma, for the warm introduction and for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I'm really excited to chat with you all today. What I wanted to highlight first and foremost is that the pandemic has really exposed a paradox in our supply chain industry. It has exposed the frailty of many transport companies and their legacy systems. At the same time, it showed the absolute resilience in the global supply chain. The containers kept moving, the boxes turned up, and for the most part, trade actually was facilitated and carried through without problem. What this slide represents is back in 2015, the maritime industry or the shipping industry was all talk about how the new technologies were going to revolutionize the movement of freight. It wasn't until 2018 and 2019 where about 50% of the industry started to do. Instead of, they stopped talking and they started doing. The other 50% are still working through spreadsheets to manage their businesses. This highlights the importance of where we're at in the industry. The industry is still behind and is still quite slow about innovation and quite wary about how to address innovation. In a 2019 report by the Australian Institute of Company Directors, they highlighted the fact that innovation in the boardroom is still lacking. 60% of Australian companies have yet to address innovation at a board level. For the supply chain and transportation industry, this is the same globally. Without the board of directors and senior managers focusing on innovation or digital transformation, those organizations will be left behind. Next slide, please. So where are we today? Today, the supply chain industry is in what is called stage 2. The change in the supply chain is following the same path of very much of the other industries. We can look at music, banking, and now the retail industries as good examples of the way forward. As the global supply chain players are starting to transform, we are starting to engage our customers and derive insights on how to improve customers' experience by connecting digitally with our customers. I anticipate that it will take 3 to 5 years for the rest of the industry to get into stage 2. And it would take 5 to 10 years for the whole industry to reach stage 3, or being fully digitally driven. Next slide, please. So all of the fourth industrial revolution technologies are having an impact on our industry. The biggest impact will be on cost savings, process change through better optimization, and finally transparency through collaboration. Big data or data analytics are having the biggest impact right now. Last week's webinar in this series was an excellent example and discussion about AI and machine learning and what is changing right now. Automation is also having a big impact on terminal operations. I'm sure Mark will discuss today that exciting area. I wanted to highlight what's happening on vessels, trucks, and trains. Moving this part of the industry, the establishment of fleet centers are not new. At Hamburg Süd, we established a fleet center 10 years ago. What is new is that automation is driving change and allowing them to have direct control from these fleet centers. As the technology matures, we will see autonomous vessels who will have few seafarers on board to mitigate risks. This will be a welcome relief given the crisis that we're having today with 400,000 sailors stuck at sea, unable to get to their home countries because of the pandemic. For trucks and trains, fully autonomous vehicles will come sometime in the next 30 years. The IoT or smart containers will transform the industry by setting a new standard. Having the ability to track your inventory in real time will upend many of the existing companies who have created business models around an opaque and dysfunctional supply chain. Next slide, please. Augmented reality or virtual reality is starting to have an impact. They will improve training, safety, and overall observations, but they will not be the catalyst that smart containers or big data will be. Blockchain will have an overall impact, but it will become the standard maybe in 10 to 15 years' time. Today, most customers are driving the requirements for blockchain or transparency, and platforms like AgLive, who are giving the clients the ability to have the confidence in what they're buying, by addressing the transparency and how and where they came from is going to have a big impact, and it will be more of a pull through of this technology. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, Peter.
Yeah.
Would you be able to explain very quickly what smart containers are?
Smart containers are containers with IoT devices or Internet of Things devices attached to them. These smart containers will either be owned and operated by the shipping companies, or what is mostly going to happen is that there are going to be different devices that will either be on the pallets or on the doors of the containers to help give the owner of that cargo direct data feeds in real time.
Thank you.
What is really important is to understand that digital transformation is less about technology and it's about people. We have an issue today where most CIOs are quite concerned that we do not have enough people to meet the requirements of this industry that is transforming. This slide from Skillsoft is a great example of the concerns of these CIOs. We need data wranglers, data scientists, and data engineers, as well as software developers, if we're going to be an industry that is truly data-driven. But we also need people that want to address the problems and want to change this industry. We have to stop, let's say, being old school, and we have to look forward and start making a decision and building a roadmap to where we want to be. Next slide, please.
May I interrupt again?
Yeah.
We hear very often the concern that people have that machines will replace man. And even if we train our employees to adopt more digital techniques, management and job design will not change fast enough to achieve the synergies or expectations you talk about for the next few years. So how do you reconcile this fear with your statement?
Well, it will be the biggest challenge. We see quite a concern on the terminal side, where the unions are fighting automation. It will be a big challenge on how we address this and how do we start identifying the right employees or the right skill sets that we can transition into managing the work and not doing the work.
Thank you.
So this is why we created Future Ports 2050. We want to create an industry-led research program that allows the universities and PhD students to address the problem that the industry is having today and help the industry transform into a truly digitally driven industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter Creeden. This looks like a very interesting program to be involved in and very necessary in the context of today's supply chain. Thank you for taking us through the trajectory of the supply chain and where digitalization contributes to better reactions, responsiveness, and reconfigurations of the modern supply chain we need today. I look forward to more discussion on this at the panel discussion. I'd like to introduce to you Mark Wells. Mark Wells is Vice President Global Partnerships at Navis, which is the world's leader in providing terminal operating systems, TOS, to over 460 customers globally. Mark Wells has been based in Asia for over 30 years and has leadership experience in businesses that provide enterprise solutions to both multinational and regionally based companies in major markets, including Japan, China, Korea, Southeast Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Australia, and New Zealand. The solution areas he has supported are physical and financial supply chain management, manufacturing, human capital management, and financial services. He's worked in most industry sectors: container terminals and intermodal logistics, automotive, electronics, retail, and apparel. Many more, both with on-premise and cloud-based platforms. Mark Wells graduated with a BA in History and East Asian Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Not only is he proficient in Mandarin after completing his studies at National Taiwan Normal University, but he takes advantage of his Hong Kong location surrounded by water, and he's a keen rower. In fact, I hear that he was once the umpire for the Dragon Boat race. So for those who are from Hong Kong, you can relate to that. I present to you Mark Wells.
Norma, thank you, and greetings all. What I wanted to talk about this morning is just working through the concept of digitalization and how it's impacting the container terminals, and touch on a few points from our industry and then also from some of our customers. If we look out over the next 3 to 5 years, some of the points that were touched on in the previous webinar that was held, what we're seeing from our research and development team and where we're being pulled by many of our customers is taking all this information and data that we have, which historically has focused on operational records and kind of looking backwards and using that information to look forward. And from that, you develop systems and inputs to the business that can start to predict and then ultimately can start to be prescriptive. And that's a very, very different way to manage a business. So against all the other challenges that the industry has had to face over the last 6 to 12 months, this will be also something that's going to be pushing the leaders in the industry as they try to take, go to the next step with regards to making sure the technology is a dynamic tool to help them better manage that business. So certainly it's something that we're seeing now, and we expect to be more and more present in a lot of different supply chains, whether it's on the maritime side or others as well. Next, please. In preparing for the webinar today, I just did a quick look back, 6 or 12 months ago, and what was life like last fall in September, and then comparing, of course, to where we are now. And as we were planning for business in 2020, the economic activity around most of the major markets we support was fairly strong, and so we saw our customers and the trends that were active at the time, that the initiatives in the supply chain were continuing forward. People were planning to continue to invest. There was interest in exploring areas and ways to better collaborate, new technologies, new platforms. Automation continues to continue to be a core theme, whether it was through retrofitting manual terminals and adding some new technology or automation to them, or actually new sites or greenfield sites. And by definition, many of them are definitely going to be fully or partially or fully automated. And again, however, our industry, most of the technology we're talking about was going to be on site, was going to be on premise, and folks weren't thinking much around cloud-based solutions. Next. Obviously, the last 6 months we've seen a dramatic drop in economic activity, and of course that certainly has impacted trade. So as Peter mentioned, the industry have been real heroes in many markets in keeping foodstuffs, medical supplies, and other critical goods moving in and out of different countries. But certainly overall, business volumes have been down. It's put an awful lot of pressure on the terminals, and so they've had to rethink some of their investments. They've had to be very creative in how they manage the manpower, both from a safety perspective and access and protecting them, as well as just trying to make sure the rostering met the business requirements. Spending, almost overnight, was curtailed, or certainly, every dollar is being double checked up at the highest levels of an organization. And so, in some parts of the supply chain, people are managing survival mode. In others, they got overly busy and we're having to manage adding tools and people to help deal with the increased demand that they had. So there was different stories in different parts of the supply chain. Collaboration, however, and the idea that technology was a tool that we sometimes would use at our discretion, all of a sudden became critical to everything that everyone was doing, whether terminals were having to manage their business remotely, where certain key staff could not come on site, whether it was having to move to more digital collaboration between customers, the freight forwarders, supply chain, and all of a sudden we had this massive leap into every day and every part of the business seemed to be online. And of course, last but not least, endless video calls with customers, internal headquarter people, internal colleagues. So the rhythm of everything that people were doing, really changed dramatically. I think this is an interesting, example of how digital and digitalization, had a chance to really again, get kickstarted into certain parts of the shipping value chain that we haven't seen. And also with regards to, click the next slide, the next button. What we're seeing is close to a third of the organizations over the last 6 to 9 months have increased their spending in software as a service. So basically, business systems that help to manage their operations that are basically dealt with online, just like a Zoom call or many of the other tools that people are using. And that's a pretty dramatic increase versus what we had seen over the last 2 or 3 years. And then equally, if you look at the industry, seeing an impressive bump in global spending on solutions that are, again, software as a services or online. So we're seeing the impact, the demand and the supply, being met across the overall industry. This is covering the majority, many different businesses, but obviously a big impact on supply chain as well. Next, please. And then another view on how on how spending and priorities for the use of technology and the procurement of technology has changed over the last 6 to 9 months. Certainly, that acceleration towards cloud technologies or technologies that are basically available through an internet connection has increased significantly. And that includes business solutions that are available on the cloud, general adoption of online systems for the business, whether it's interacting with customers or doing internal work, and then by definition, that's really driving a digital transformation in certain operations where paper is going away and people are learning to interact much more effectively and dynamically online, so to speak, versus because they did not have the luxury of any face-to-face time. Next. I think as Peter also commented, what we're seeing is that the digitalization has really only begun in many different industries and many different markets. And you'll see number 6 there, travel, transport, and logistics. Again, we're just in the beginning. The industry itself is really just in the beginning of this transformation. We historically, in some markets, in some parts of the industry, have been fairly slow adopters. To be fair, many of the times. Many of the reasons for that is that quick adoption didn't necessarily impact the bottom line or didn't necessarily radically increase customer interaction, and so there was a balance there on when to spend and how to spend. The last 6 months have really upended that, I think, quite significantly. So I think it's fair to say we're going to see an acceleration or continued acceleration on the back of what everyone's been doing over the last 6 months, and from that. The shipping supply chain, I think, will continue to probably accelerate its adoption across certain sectors and certain markets. Next. And again, we had a chance to survey some of our customers about a month ago and trying to ask them, what trends are they seeing impacting their business, and how is that how is that impacting where they're looking to spend their time and their money. And again, coming back to the previous webinar number 3, data utilization and making better use of the information that the terminals have and that their supply chains have access to is very, very top of mind. And then kind of related to that is more and more automation. So whether that's automating machinery, automating processes, having information and systems communicate so that they're making certain decisions on our behalf against the parameters that we set, is something that we've seen to some degree over the last 3 to 5 years, and certainly it's only going to continue and accelerate going forward. Next. And then again, with regards to other trends, our friends from McKinsey have published some research about 2 months back, and I think relevant to ourselves here from the supply chain side. The digitalization really, in this case, we're looking at increased spending from technology. The IT side is going to be looking to continue to drive efficiencies. We've already talked about automation, and so ports and terminals will continue to go down that path In some cases, probably at a faster pace than what's really expected. And then finally, again, cloud-based software is something that people would talk about a year ago, and now it's driving much or most of the business day for many of our customers or many of our customers' customers. Next. Wanted to also talk about how our interaction with certain customers has changed, quite dramatically over the last half year. We had obviously a number of, with all the customers that we either have new projects or ongoing projects going on. They could be implementing new software, could be upgrades to a newer version. And as it turned out, in your backyard there in Australia, Patrick had just recently done an upgrade at Port Botany. And what we found is this had been planned for close to a year, and the business made a decision they wanted to find a way to move forward with the project and not put it on hold. And so we had travel restrictions both from customer resources and from our own resources. We had some other challenges with regards to working remotely, but at the end of the day, we had 24/7 support from our team in India and in the US. And we were able to get everyone the terminal live and up and running. And what was interesting is that we found that the remote support, because they were kind of not on site, and we call it white noise, or there's an awful lot of activity and adrenaline, and when you cut over to a new system. And so as it turned out, the remote folks were able to work overnight, provide any updates or fixes when people came in the next morning. And so the efficiency of that really almost sort of doubled, and we were able to kind of go live and get settled down in almost half the time that we expected. And so some very interesting lessons learned there, and something that I think the industry is going to demand vendors like ourselves to continue to think in these ways so we can be more efficient and keep costs under control, so that everyone's adding value where where it's best needed. Next. And then 3 other examples from other parts of the world in Malta, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. 3 customers over the last couple of months were just upgrading to new versions of the system. The process was handled 100% remotely in partnership with key users on the customer side. Risk assessments were done in advance, and so everyone had done enough testing and pre-planning, and that really was critical to make sure that the upgrades went well. But again, proving once again that there are ways to do some of the work that historically has been done with people and consultants on site, that we can do some of these things remotely. And so again, another example of how digital tools have, and necessity around what was required the last couple of months have forced us to rethink how to use it and prove to customers that this in fact is a way that going forward that we can continue to leverage technology and continue to do work around systems, whether it's existing systems or even implementing new ones. Next. For ourselves, we had to react very, very quickly, and again with our organization and a number of unsung heroes for sure. But almost overnight, we had to start thinking about how do we provide services remotely, and this could be around maintaining applications and helping customers test, dealing with their data or database, monitor and provide diagnostic services, training, whether a customer is doing a new project, ongoing training for resources. Again, all being leveraged a lot of remote technologies, and at the end of the day, the business continuity was key, and that really was driving a lot of the information, a lot of the activity that we were driving. Next.
Thank you, Peter. Mark Wells. When we realized that advanced container ports like the very impressive Yantian International Container Terminal in Shenzhen, it's reputed to be one of the busiest container ports in the world. And this has risen from the swamps of Shenzhen 10 years ago. So it's not only the deep water port only, but the whole package of advanced computer handling facilities and computer management systems, as you spoke about the terminal operating systems, which you and Peter Creeden spoke about. I think that's a very important look, and that whole package needs to be, has to be offered. So thank you, Mark Wells. I look forward to more discussion on these challenges at the panel session. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Daryll Hull. Daryll Hull has been active in industry, business, government, and academia in Australia and overseas for 40 years. He was a senior public servant in Australia and a long-time mission leader for technology-based policy advice with the United Nations in various Southeast Asian countries, China and India. He has worked in Europe on matters of work organization and management, based in Oxford at Ruskin College and at the Inter-University Centre in Dubrovnik. He serves on numerous occasions as director and chair of many companies in diversified industries. He has achieved the status of fellow in various bodies like the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and Global Labour Organization. So you see, Daryll Hull is a multifaceted operator and is known as a font of knowledge and a thought leader. And yet, rather than intimidate you with his vast knowledge, Daryll Hull is able to put all of this into simple terms, which make down-to-earth sense. We at Macquarie University have been indeed very fortunate to have Daryll Hull holding a professorial appointment in the Centre for Workforce Futures in Macquarie Business School. Location-wise, Daryll Hull straddles comfortably between busy inner city Sydney and the more relaxed Hunter Valley, where he is known as a vigneron, enjoying his grapes and wine. Daryll Hull earned the first-class honours in his Bachelor of Commerce in Industrial Relations and a PhD from the University of New South Wales. So I present to you Daryll Hull.
Thanks, Norma. Well, as the old curse goes, may you live in interesting times. And Peter and Mark have shown us some very interesting emerging futures for ports and big data. Supply chain logistics, including ports, was before COVID-19 undergoing systemic shifts in all aspects of operations and organisation. We're now looking at what some are calling the great acceleration of changes as to how business is done. The expression 6 years in 6 months springs to mind. I admit to being excited and fearful at the same time. Excited by the prospect of new organisation and business models based on digitalisation and automation. Fearful of our government and corporate ability to manage the new possibilities, especially in the workplace. So I want in the next few minutes to raise some of the existential questions that keep me up at night to share the pain with you. Underneath all this is my fundamental fear that if we're not part of the answer to these questions, we must be part of the problem. Next. To delve into my questions, I have to pivot briefly the conversation away from startups, big data and operation science and into the dark arts that underpin and drive digitalisation in supply chain and ports. I refer, of course, to the social sciences, loosely known as economics, politics and sociology. And I want to introduce you to two of my favourite social scientists who had things to say about the situation we find ourselves in today. The first is Nikolai Kondratiev and the second is Joseph Schumpeter. Kondratiev is most famous for the discovery of the K-waves in economics. He postulates that new technologies like digitalisation come in waves about every 50 to 60 years apart, and when they arrive, they disrupt the conventional wisdom in ways that are predictable and to therefore an extent manageable. He's never been disproven in his theories, and he wouldn't be at all surprised to discover digitalisation today in supply chains. Joseph Schumpeter is perhaps more widely known, most widely known for the phrase creative destruction, when speaking of the global economic system we call capitalism. The idea of creative discussion lives in the same house as digital disruption and seeks to explain a kind of inevitable movement to break old business models, reshape corporations, and change the markets. It is, according to Schumpeter and his followers, a normal and necessary activity in our economics and our societies. Nothing to be alarmed about. Next. I'm not so certain about these predictions and our ability to manage them for all mankind. In the words of a futurist whom I think has got a keen eye to contradictions on the future and potential of technology, life in the future will not be like Star Trek. We can imagine a future with instant transportation devices, replicators, medical devices that heal wounds with magic lasers, but we still have to contend with the key variables that seem to be missing from these idyllic and necessary futures. I mean, of course, human stupidity and greed. We will most likely still be driven by factors we know all about and choose to ignore or play down. For example, people will continue to make less than perfect decisions. People will continue to choose self-interest over public good. People will continue to get it wrong at least as much as they get it right when it comes to digitalisation in supply chain logistics and ports. So bear with me as I walk you through some parts of the valley of the shadow of great acceleration, with special reference to the world of supply chain logistics. Next. Can we, for example, imagine a world of bosses without workers? As digitalisation sweeps like a tsunami across the supply chains of the world, including ports, it reshapes the very nature of organisation. I recall when automated drilling machines entered factories in the 60s and 70s, the response of German companies was to focus the data flows on the machines and to skill up the operators. The British response was to literally cut the data processing out of the machines and run a cable up to the supervisor's office so they could program and control the processes, leaving the machine operators standing around. To what extent will the digitalisation of supply chain logistics force or promote changes in management systems in ports? How will managers manage in the future? In fact, is there actually a role for managers and supervisors in a digitalised company? Next. On the other side of the equation, if AI and big data and applications personalise and humanise production and service provision, will we see the rise of more autonomous agents, as they say, more self-employed, with more ability to have augmented workers who need less or no supervision at all? As we focus more on data, we will need a new generation of skilled and compliant knowledge workers. The ports community is already aware of this dilemma, but where will they come from? We already know there's a growing gap between supply and demand for such workers globally, as Peter pointed out. Who trains them? Universities can hardly keep up with the knowledge base at the moment, much less design courses, much less produce graduates at scale of the needs of the supply chain logistics sector with ports in the middle of the chain. Where do we draw the line between in-house learning, on-the-job training, formal education, and recognition of skills? More than this, how and who will set the guidelines for job design, organisation forms and skills in the future? Do we let 1,000 flowers bloom? If we do, whither go standards and certification in such a world? Next. Next. Moving on. Innovation in technologies allows for the possible creation of organisation without actual offices and factories. We already have the rise of what's called anywhere working theories, and a growing concern amongst those who build buildings in the cities that there may not be a need for offices, foyers, computer rooms, lunchrooms, and all the logistics of the CBD. In fact, the idea of a workplace will be unrecognisable from the last 300 years of physical location and concentration of people in a single location to do the work. And ports, in this case shipping ports, are the classic case of location, location, location. You can't easily move a port, but you can shift the people. COVID-19 has dramatically accelerated the move away from physical location and the move towards working from home and remotely. This also propels the idea of managing people into a new space. How do you supervise people at a distance? Supply chain logistics business models contain an element of remote working in any event, but this will now be a step change towards truly flexible forms and agile operations. Are we ready to do this? I have to say I'm not optimistic about the transition. There's too much vested interest in many companies in preserving the status quo ante. Next. Let's return to the vexed question of skills. We've been raised in a sector where hard skills are valued. Ports are driven by systems, schedules, regulations and technology. Not so much recognised are valued soft skills, apparently. Yet we all know the soft skills are critical to our businesses. Client and customer relationships are underpinned by soft skills, for example. In a complex port environment, getting on with everybody is vital to keep things moving. In a digitalised port, what's the place for soft skills? I would argue that it's more important than ever. With systems talking to each other, with real-time decisions possible, the skills of collaboration, creativity and innovation come to the forefront. We can outsource big data to expert groups, but our core business remains dealing with people inside and outside our walls, stakeholders ranging from government to community to suppliers to customers. Keeping track of the systems is not the same as keeping close to our stakeholders. Next. Beyond the argument over soft and hard skills lies a new horizon for ports in the future, capability building of people. The combination of skills, experience and knowledge are driven closer together as digitalisation increases. Adaptable and flexible staff will be highly valued. This is not to play down the need for trained and skilled operators. It highlights the potential for growth using data technologies, coupled with people who can make best use of the new technologies on the job, every day, and with confidence. Most good operators in the supply chain logistics world know this already. The issue is how to accelerate and sustain the capability of the workforce going forward. Can we rely on existing institutions to fill the gap? Next. And finally, in the world I live in, higher education is under challenge from every direction in Australia and elsewhere. Even with COVID and government policies confronting them, universities were already trying to come to terms with a fundamental question: who actually needs a 3 or 4 year degree to thrive in business? The answer seems to be certain STEM fields, a number of knowledge-based disciplines, and maybe the occasional expert non-STEM field, example, strategy planning. However, in ports and logistics, the call's been going out for customised short courses, example, port operations in a specific location. The business asking for these courses don't actually care if they're attached to a university or a degree. More than this, big technology companies are reaching out and offering certification and credentialing in their own names, for example, IBM. And professional associations, e.g. Engineers Australia, are also looking at this approach. Universities run the risk of being left behind as the pace of change accelerates in the coming decade in supply chain logistics. In the word of an old musical, and I quote, "I think we'd better think it out again," unquote, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Daryll. Wow, I thought we were going to cope with the challenge of quick evolution and response, but now you've exposed some real doubts on whether we can do this fast enough and effectively enough, and with the right people, the right management and government directives. Thanks, Daryll Hull, for your probing presentation and making me somewhat concerned. Before we go on to the audience questions, let's discuss some quick takeaways and questions from our discussion. So I would invite all panelists, feel free to participate in these takeaways and questions. The first one, I think, maybe I could ask Mark Wells, could you address the first dot point that I've got there?
Yes, and so this is both. I think I stole this from a podcast I heard a few months back, and it also Daryll hit on it as well, where there was so much almost overnight. So many. There was such an acceleration of how people had to interact. Again, with very little warning, with various lockdowns and many of the markets around the world, that all of a sudden everything went online, and whether it's video calls or more and more interaction through different types of technology. And so these changes that people thought would be coming in a couple of years out, all of a sudden, again, occurred, very, very quickly. And so the concept of, I think that's also a play on a phrase from Lenin, if I remember correctly. So it's just that it felt as if some are saying, we actually in 2030 versus 2020, in the sense of how quickly we've had to change how we've worked, where we work, and what does work even mean. And so that's what sort of inspired that. And like I said, I saw that from our customers, that the port was shut down overnight. We had to have admin office folks work from home. They had to figure out a way to safely keep staff on the terminal site. And so we're a very, very, very dynamic environment. But again, it sort of gave a quick window into the future that people have been talking about, and again, it's something that folks had to deal with in a very, very short period of time.
Mm-hmm. And Peter Creeden, I think looking from your presentation, looking at digitalisation, creating winners and losers.
Yep. What's the question?
It's a statement that you made in this takeaway, so maybe you could enlarge on that.
It is going to create winners and losers. It's those who do not start addressing digitalization and trying to focus on building a roadmap as to how to work in a digital ecosystem will be left behind. There's no need to be conservative anymore. We actually need to identify what needs to be done. And to Daryll's point is, how do we empower the employees at the front end level to use all of the tools that they have to get the job done, and get closer to the stakeholders and customers to deliver the right product at the right time. That is what's critical. It's not about managing or holding back. It's about how we move forward.
Yes, but Mark Wells, you believe that people are more adaptable. Would that be the case?
It's funny that Peter made a reference to this as well. You know, it's not about the technology; it's about the people. And so, in the sense that, you know, management skills, team dynamics, you know, are still critical to running efficient operations or world-class operations, regardless of what technology, you know, people are using. And I've seen it over my working life, where different organizations would have the same, you know, distribution, manufacturing systems, or they would have the same terminal operating systems, and you look at their output and how they manage them, and what their service levels were, and what the productivity that they were achieving. And in some cases, the contrast is quite extreme. And then you dig into, why is that? Well, it's the attitude of the staff, and it's the attitude and the leadership from the terminal itself. And so, at the end of the day, people, you know, are a critical component to driving successful organizations. And that includes dealing with, you know, all the change that it continues to be thrown at us, either self-imposed or from outside forces. And so, and I've seen that time and again, and I stand by that as a, you know, practical example of why, you know, why that's still, you know, folks are still critical of this whole process.
And I think this is, so it's reflected by Daryll. When you talked about your hard skills versus soft skills, would you like to make a comment about this particular point?
My experience, everything from bulk shipping, containerization, ro-ro, and now digitalisation, is that we have a highly industrialised workforce, which we do in Australia, West Coast states, East Coast states, and Europe. It is not a simple matter of saying people are adaptable. You actually have to negotiate the change. And if you look at what's happening in Australia right now, today, literally today, the industrial relations beast rears its head again. And the question of whether the workforce will be flexible and move to digitalised and automated systems has nothing to do with the technology. It's got to do with the industrial relationships. And that's where I think I have less hope that we'll be able to deal with this in an optimal fashion, as opposed to stumbling through it as we always have done in the last 40 years.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's a good time to address what Tristan Anderson has asked. He says, in the light of current union actions at Port Botany, how does this propel automation? Are port workers showing that they can upskill from manual labor to working in an automated environment?
Well, with that, I'll only say this, then I'll shut up and let Mark and Peter have a go. Or the issue is not can they do it. I mean, workforces globally have shown amazing resilience and adaptability given the opportunity and the tools to do the job in the space. But their concern is not about digitalisation. Their concern is about working conditions, employment, and future jobs. And unless we address that as part of the overall transition strategy to digitalisation, we will have blood on the floor for the next 5 or 10 years, especially in Australia and especially the West Coast of the States, where the unions are already saying this is our last barricade. This is the Alamo for us, because when I started working in industry in 1968, there were over 7,000 workers, MUA in Sydney alone. Now there are less than 500, and technology is the difference. So unless you can find a way out for people on the job to transition as well as learn, they will fight. And frankly, I would fight with them. I mean, you just can't take my job off me. You've got to tell me what the future looks like.
Yeah, thank you. Peter and Mark, would you like to comment on this, or shall we move to the next point?
Come on, I dare you.
Yeah, no, I would if you don't mind. So last December, I was at a conference in the Northeast US, and one of the last sessions that was held was the president of Long Beach Container Terminal and the head of his union. So Long Beach Container Terminal, fully automated, the first fully automated container terminal in North America. And they use our system and a lot of other related technologies. And they talk through the process that's just been highlighted. How, what did they do to get where they were? At that point, they'd been live about 18 months with the new system and had been operating, fairly successfully. And my takeaways from that was, it was about a partnership, a recognition of the challenges. Let's get them all on the table and let's figure out what's needed to get from where we are to where we need to be, understanding that, some of these forces, whether it's for competitive reasons, for environmental reasons, for other business reasons, some of these technologies are going to be implemented. They cannot be ignored or not going to be allowed to be ignored. So how do we manage that transition from fully manual terminal to fully automated? And this concept of partnership and working with people, it wasn't easy. The dynamic on the stage was very, very interesting, almost, somewhat strained. But they, whether they like each other or not, management and the head of the unions realized that they were in this together. And with that attitude, they actually, one of the big takeaways from that was they had 6 months after operation, the union had more people working on the terminal than they did when they did the initial planning. So they're able to create work and reassign certain parts of the workforce to have a generally a fairly a somewhat positive outcome from a numbers perspective, and just trying to work their way through these challenges. And so it's a one case, it's one area, but it is, I think it's an interesting example of how these things are going to have to work going forward. And it will be fits and starts. It's not going to be easy, but ignoring the problem is not going to help. 100% confrontation is not going to drive certain outcomes. And so how do you work that balance? And I think LBCT proved that they look to have seen to been able to strike one, at least at that time.
Thank you, Mark. I think the next 2 points.
I just wanted to jump in. I think Anthony Otto from Long Beach, he showed true leadership there, and he did address what Daryll was saying is that delicate balance on how to shift the work. It is a compromise, it is a discussion, how to move it forward, but how do you also show leadership on getting people excited on playing with the new toys or the new tools to get the job done? And I think that's is a great example of what happened in Long Beach.
Yeah, and I think that leads us very nicely into the next 2 points, where, and also a question associated with that from Amrik Sohal from Monash University, where he asks, if digitalization is more about people and needs to be led by top executives, then I feel that many executives are not going to be successful as they are out of touch with their people and know little about the emerging technologies. Would any of my panelists like to comment on this? Maybe Peter first.
I think that it's more of a statement than a question, but that is correct. I think that you will see a major shift in organizations' leadership as we transition into a data-driven company or a data-driven industry. A lot of the managers today still want to be able to reach out and grab an employee. The COVID-19 and the pandemic has really shaken them to the core, because they would have preferred to see people in the office, and they lack the trust of their employees to do the work at home. So I think everyone's learning, and those who have been resistant to change have been forced, and they will have to learn very quickly on how to adapt and how to actually trust their employees or trust the organization to get the job done. And hopefully it will turn the focus on looking for those leaders to stop looking at themselves and patting themselves on the shoulder, and then focusing on the people on the front lines and giving them the tools and the skills so they can be the leaders and drive the change.
Thank you. We have a question from Bill Hovey. How loudly should we cheer for the Prime Minister's announcement that the government's thought bubble about digitalisation features a move by all government agencies to use electronic invoices. Is there a gap in the understanding of the policymakers about what is digitalisation?
Specifically, the Australian government has not been an advocate for digitalization and or innovation. They systematically have clearly misunderstood what is required. I think with the announcements this week are still 10 years behind of where we need to be and the thought that needs to be driven. So I could go on. But.
Now, can I say, Norma, just to take this one and the one prior, if we see the government as a board and we see companies having executives and managers and supervisors, my concern, and I'm doing some work with some ports now, as you know, is that even if the board or government actually get their head around this stuff, and I'm with Peter and I assume Mark that it's not going to be easy, but they have to get their head around it, otherwise it'll get around their heads. Even if you get the leaders in the organisations at the executive level on board, and there are a lot of consultants out there now taking executive teams through this process, my concern is not for them. There's enough money and resources for them to actually learn, hopefully. I'm concerned about the managers and the supervisors in the places, because these are the ones that actually have to deal with remote working and staff and so forth. I'm not worried about the executive being out of touch with their staff. I'm worried about the managers who have to be in touch with their staff remotely. And we don't have the tools and the technologies available, certainly not the culture, to make that happen or facilitate it. So I'd like to see a pivot away from talking about executives and leaders and go to where the rubber hits the road, which is going to be supervisors, managers and staff having to work in a totally different way on a day-to-day basis. And we haven't even started to ask that question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that the last point in this slide is very interesting, because if we talk about collaboration and transparency, my question is between which parties? And this really opens up some interesting conversations with the ports and the shipping lines. And we look at necessitating movement of cargo in and out of Australia using a much better combination of road, rail, and shipping, particularly coastal shipping. So in terms of communication, collaboration, we see, do you feel that the feedback to shipping lines, railway operators like Toll and Linfox, and road transport operators, are they part of the solution? Daryll, you'd be the person to talk, or Peter.
No, I was going to let Mark and Peter grab hold of that one by the tail and see if it's actually a tiger or a puppy. My sense is, in terms, by the way, that we've got a way to go. I mean, they'll have more inside knowledge than me, but my experience with shipping companies and terminal operators is that digitalisation is the least of their worries. They've got other commercial relationships they're trying to sort out between themselves globally. And hopefully digitalisation doesn't get lost in the wash, because I'm with Mark. If you can get collaboration and put the issues on the table industrially or commercially, you can resolve all of this. But remember my prediction number 7. Life in the future is not going to be like Star Trek. People aren't going to simply come together and fly the Starship Enterprise. It's going to be, I think, a real challenge to get that collaboration, even though it is the obvious, sensible thing for people to do. People don't always do the obvious, sensible thing.
I think it's a point, collaboration, one of the biggest the barriers to collaboration is data interoperability, the ownership of data. And we're starting to see that play out with TradeLens and a few other players, where people are trying to lock up the data and own it. And that is not the way forward. The way forward is to share data with your digital partnerships and ecosystems and find ways to drive acceleration. If people insist on lack of collaboration and holding their data and thinking that it is some kind of a gold mine not to be shared, they will be left behind. Daryll, you made the point that the shipping companies are not focused on this. I think they are. 2 years ago, I would have agreed with you, but now they critically see that they have to upgrade their systems away from legacy systems and focus on understanding on how to move forward. I think Maersk is taking a leadership role here where they're pushing for rate management. Now they have 41% of their overall rates are being done on what's called spot rating. And that is a huge change in the industry. This is driving the industry to become more self-service, much more like the airline industry, but they're about 10 years behind where the airline industry are today. So we're seeing an acceleration. Hopefully we'll see more collaboration in the future.
Yeah,
Thank you
and if I could
Yes.
just comment, then also to Peter's point, there's still the shipping supply chain. It still has many more silos, shall we say, than a lot of other supply chains, and they are behind the curve on this. And I'll share a visual. If you can think of an F1 tire change, right, where the in and out in about 6 or 2 or 3 seconds, all that takes preparation. So what if a vessel visit to a terminal was able to happen in half or a third of the current time? And the opportunities are there, but it demands an amazing amount of collaboration kind of before, during, and after a visit. And a lot of that is data driven, and the ability to share on common platforms and to share information in advance and get away from the analog process where someone takes a diskette or a USB stick and they take it from the terminal and give it to the captain and he puts it on. Time is money. And the economic incentives have been up and down on cost of fuel and other dynamics in the shipping chain. But going forward, if you're trying to drive efficiency, be a good neighbor and reduce carbon emissions and all these other criteria that are occasionally thrown out there, there are better ways to do this. Information does want to be free more often than not, and so how to find that balance in a commercial environment. So there's a lot more sharing, going on under whatever approach people want to take. But certainly, if you want to benchmark against other supply chains, again, air cargo and just the general airline industry as an example, certainly a fair bit amount of work to be done.
Thank you, Mark. I think we've got this last slide here, which looks at 3 important questions. So if we can keep these questions in mind, I think we have answered some of them. Because of the time, I need to go on. And so keeping this in mind, do you want to address any of these in particular, panelists?
Yeah, if I make just the top one. So where do we find the skilled and capable knowledge workers for a digitalized port? Do a case study at Rotterdam. They built out some new terminals, fully automated, variety of technologies, some of ours, some other people's, but we do have a view of that. And I think the organizations took 2 very different approaches to how they wanted to staff their terminals. And I think at the end of the day, it's fair to say that an organization that has people who understands the terminal business, who understands how a terminal operates, and layers on these new tools and these new technologies, and kind of figures out how to use them to the best effect, can be and has shown itself to be a more productive workforce versus if you take folks from just a knowledge area only, who have limited or no experience in an actual industry and its actual processes, and so therefore I think that speaks well to the opportunity for existing, the ability to upskill existing folks because they have that knowledge and that domain knowledge, and understand what it means to keep customers happy. But then they've just got to learn how to use new tools, and that happened with containerization many 2 generations ago, and this is just going to continue forward. And so we've seen that directly in some cases, but I think it's fair to say that domain knowledge is critical, so that's finding ways to upskill existing workforce, I think can result in some a stronger team than folks who were a little bit more focused on technology only.
So is this time for the younger generation who are mostly digital natives?
Yes, but they need to understand. They need to understand the industry as well. They need to, I guess, have a passion for freight and moving things and having willingness to solve problems. Logistics and supply chain is just about solving problems and having fun with it. And I think if you pair that with the tools that are out there, then you're going to have a great career.
And I say, Norma, that I agree with what Mark and Peter have said. But what we've been exceptionally bad at in the ports and shipping community is transferring corporate knowledge between generations.
Yes.
People hang on to IP in their heads for the last 2 generations, if I can take Mark's baseline. Somehow we've got to come up with transition processes if this is to work. I want to finish on a more optimistic note, if I may, where people are capable, our generation, are capable of taking what we know on I think Mark called it domain knowledge, that what we know, and transferring that to the younger people coming through, your digital natives, because you can't just overlay digital natives on a body of corporate knowledge that's informal and held in the heads of existing generations. And we're not very good at making that transfer. So to me, the bit in the middle that's missing that we can deal with is come up with ways of getting that on-the-job experience, knowledge, and the new technologies and digitalisation into the one place inside an organisation. I think that's the challenge.
Thank you. Just one last comment here, and that is looking at the surrounding infrastructure. If intermodal transport is emphasizing rail, then don't we need very fast trains from less congested areas, which allow the development and construction of state-of-the-art supporting infrastructure? The question is, where is the government's stomach on allowing this to happen and taking control of allocating areas of development? If it is coastal shipping, do we need again to think about the infrastructure that needs to develop and accommodate rapid load and unload mechanisms?
I would like to take this.
Yes,
intermodal.
You take it.
The ports are a natural feed for coastal shipping or for intermodal rail. Intermodal rail, we need better management and better communication between the rail operators and the terminals. I think Navis is actually doing a lot of great work on integrating those two worlds overseas. Hopefully that some of their technology is coming here to Australia to help get away from the old consis mentality. In regards to the infrastructure specifically for New South Wales, there is no need to double the rail capacity in and out of Port Botany. That was proven about 10 years ago that if we could just optimize the rail windows in and out of Port Botany, we could double the containers going out to, say, Moorebank or to the intermodal terminals in the metro area. But it's about the willingness and cost. Logistics is like water. It will always flow downhill. Gravity and the cost of what we do. So it has to be cheaper, it has to be more efficient, and it has to be better. So rail will take off when it is cheaper and it provides a very good service. The same as coastal shipping. It's about service quality and speed and efficiency. So coastal shipping would be far less expensive than interstate rail in Australia, and it should be a viable option. But there are rules and the cabotage laws in Australia make it complicated. But the process of getting a container onto a terminal and then off a terminal, say in Fremantle, delays the process. If we could cut that down to 12 hours either side, then coastal shipping would actually be a competitive format against rail or other means. The majority of trucks moving cargo from Melbourne to Queensland every day is appalling. If we're going to make an impact on our environmental targets, we need to address that, and we need all modes of transportation. We need rail, we need trucks, and we need ships to get the job done. And we have to look at freight transport in a holistic perspective, not in their different nodes. And I'm a huge advocate that we're one industry, not different industries.
Thank you, Peter. I think that's a very good concluding statement. A lot of messages in that. We've been incredibly fortunate to have the participation and contribution of our panelists. They're very knowledgeable and experienced in different aspects of digitalization, of transportation and logistics. And they have the foresight to anticipate the pitfalls and challenges along the way. So thank you. And at this stage, and on behalf of Macquarie Business School, I'd like to convey, again, our sincere appreciation to our panelists, Peter Creeden, Mark Wells, and Daryll Hull, for their superb presentations and discussions in our topic, digitalization, the new normal for logistics and transportation. I'd also like to thank my support team, Razia Tavaloy, Alina G, and Carlos Abeja. I certainly value your support through the conduct of these webinars. Very grateful to our sponsor, the Port of Newcastle, for their continuous support and encouragement. And I also thank our supporters, Michigan State University Broad College of Business, and particularly to Macquarie Business School and the Center for Workforce Futures and Macquarie University itself. Various areas within the school of the university, the research office, corporate engagement, alumni association, our IT area, and the Department of Management for buying into these webinars and promoting them and making them part of their own, helping to make them a success. Here I include all the research groups, academic associations, and student and alumni groups, industry and academic colleagues here and overseas. I certainly appreciate all the help and support given. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your feedback, interesting questions, and for many of you staying with us all the way from the first series of our supply chain webinars to the end of this, our second series. As usual, we will release the recording of this session to all those who registered. And we hope you remain safe and well. And as soon as the COVID borders are removed, we will be able to discuss, probe, debate face-to-face again. We wish you all the best. Thank you.